After emerging from World War II, the world changed rapidly. We entered a modern society defined by the decolonization of all European empires and the simultaneous rise of the United States due to increased consumerism from the baby boomer generation. Consumed with post-war debt, European powers were no longer able to afford to maintain control of their African colonies. This allowed for African nationalists to negotiate decolonization very quickly and with minimal casualties. The result? Over 27 new countries in Africa achieved autonomy or outright independence from their European colonial rulers between 1945 and 1960. Modernization also introduced technological innovation that evolved at breakneck speed from the 50s onwards. At the same time, attitudes on sexuality, gender equality, race, and race relations were quickly evolving in the US and UK. Unfortunately, not at the same pace as decolonization and technology. Among the West and Central African nations formerly under European rule, social, intellectual, and technological advancements resulted in increasingly deeper political awareness and the demand for greater respect and self-determination. Access and inclusivity were becoming an integral part of the employment and education conversations. The world was entering new territory.
Really, things are always improving as the world is changing today. There's globalization, technology is advancing. So, really, at first, for example, in BSD, there are so many things that the student never know about. But today, for example, computers. When BSD started, there were no computers lab. The library was not the way it is today. So really, from strength to strength, from the director, Mr. Biboom, and Madame Margaret, really things have been improving because today when you come to BSD, they have a good computer lab. When you go to the library, there are a lot of books for the students, and the infrastructures in terms of maybe water supply. They also have boreholes, the electricity, all those things. So really, the BSD is not that way as it was back then. Things have improved, and really all these things, they have created a condition for these students which is very conducive for their studies, because I believe that if you are comfortable, if you are in a good environment, and you have access to maybe learning resources and other teaching aids, you can learn better.
After World War II, political parties started to emerge in both the French and the British sector of Cameroon. Most of them demanded independence, and some parties wanted the two parts of the country to be united. It was in this Cameroon that Aloy would be born and raised, blah, 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 all the way to 1960, when Ahidjo proclaimed independence of the Republic of Cameroon in the former French Cameroon. He's inaugurated president and starts working to reunite the British and French territory. Meanwhile, abroad in
the European, being in the position of power, had one yardstick. He didn't use anybody else's yardstick. His yardstick was the yardstick. But what has happened, and most Europeans don't realize it, time has changed.
With this new sense of dignity and this new sense of self-respect, a new Negro came into being with a new determination to suffer, to struggle, to sacrifice, and even to die if necessary in order to be free.
And as the people in Africa and Asia get some power of their own, they get a mind of their own. The European yardstick now isn't necessarily the yardstick.
The Negro came to feel that he was somebody.
Race had emerged as the touchstone of the post-war world. By the 1950s, colonial rule had produced an elite of African nationalist intellectuals, and behind them, large, urbanized and literate working classes. Together, they witnessed the power of nationalism. In Egypt, where Gamal Abdel Nasser expelled the British, and in Algeria, where the resistance stood firm in its war of liberation from France. At the same time, the presence of the United Nations, the rise of the civil rights movement in the United States, and the nascent anti-apartheid movement focused the lens of world scrutiny on black rights and spurred on colonized Africans in their call for self-sovereignty. But it was too late to buy loyalty to the empire. War had released a powerful genie from a bottle: African nationalism. Africans were about to get a global platform for their struggle. With the war's end in 1945, the world powers pledged never again in the form of the United Nations. The new UN Charter explicitly promised self-sovereignty, with a committee dedicated to hear the grievances of colonized peoples. Throughout the 1930s, an economic depression had loomed over Europe, and the running costs of colonial administrations had soared since the start of the war. At the same time, Europe's economic crisis devalued the prices of Africa's raw goods. War-torn economies now buckled under the burden of running colonies overseas. The driver of colonialism once again became a catalyst for change: money.
Britain was bankrupt after the Second World War, and it simply couldn't afford to go on running them. My grandfather was then working in the Gold Coast, and he was sending rice and ground nuts back to his 4 sons in Britain. And they write pathetically grateful letters. Thank you for sending us this food. And I think the irony of that is amazing. You know, Africa feeding very hungry Britain.
But even as late as the 1950s, many in Europe allowed themselves to believe the empire could endure.
The visit of the Great White Queen that touched the Nigerian imagination.
Instead, the colonial powers were about to discover that exposing their subjects to world events had planted the seeds of their own rapid downfall.
The aspirations of Africans themselves changed after the end of the Second World War, which altered everything. Colonial troops had fought alongside the British to defend other parts of the empire. They became more aware of the world.
From the jungles of Burma, tough veteran West and East African troops arrive at Bombay on their way home. And their fighting skills struck terror into the Japanese. They were masters of jungle warfare.
They'd learned something else. In India, they'd seen the nationalists challenging the British. Geoffrey Adorma returned to the Gold Coast with a new insight.
Well, the Indians were very, very political. They were very political. We had conversation with some of them. They said, why are we fighting for Britain? Then we say we are fighting for world freedom. So they ask us, are you yourself free? We said, no. He said, well, fight for your freedom first. As I said, this had a very big impression on the Gold Coast soldiers. Me especially, it had a big impression on me.
The African struggle for self-rule, which would soon spread to other parts of the continent, began in the British colony of the Gold Coast, where only 5,000 Britons, mostly traders, lived alongside 2 million Africans. Trouble began when demonstrations led by army veterans turned into violent riots, and 29 were killed. The protests were turned into a mass movement by Kwame Nkrumah. A charismatic campaigner known as Iron Boy, he founded a political party and told Africans, we have the right to govern ourselves. Following Gandhi, he asked Africans to take direct action and demand self-rule immediately. He organized a boycott of British goods and a general strike. The British saw him as a dangerous firebrand, probably under communist influence, and put him in prison. The jailing of Nkrumah gave a new impetus to the campaign to replace rule by the governor through African chiefs with an elected government.
Victory for us in the struggle of CPP. There is victory for us. Forward, never, backward, never. In the name of great CPP, there is victory.
The people of the Gold Coast had had their own assembly under the British, but not independence. In 1957, they became the first black Africans to get complete freedom. Leaders from East and West came to Accra to see the handover. Vice President Nixon represented the United States. He arrived with a delegation that included civil rights leader Martin Luther King.
A new order is coming into being, and an old order is passing away. It seems to me that this is fit testimony to the fact that eventually the forces of justice triumph in the universe, and somehow the universe itself is on the side of freedom and justice.
The British were proud of the peaceful nature of the transfer.
For Dr. Nkrumah, main architect of Ghana's independence, this is a day of fulfillment. The longing to be free, the need to be free, these are part of the rightful heritage of man, a heritage denied to colonial Africa until now.
The Gold Coast was renamed Ghana, with a parliamentary system modelled on Westminster. Committing themselves to civil rights, the new government put up a huge commemorative arch.
Here, but a handful of years ago, men laid down their lives for a cause that was not yet won, for freedom, for justice.
Komla Bedema had been with Nkrumah from the start. Now he shared the glory.
And in the subdued light, we mounted the platform and were all ready when the lights all went on at 5 minutes to 12. With me standing on the right hand side of Nkrumah, everybody was happy. The cheering probably is still resounding, but we don't hear it.
At long last, the battle has ended. Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever. From now on, there is a new African in the world. That new African is ready to fight his own battle and show that after all, the black man is capable of managing his own affairs. I'm happy to state that in accordance with your wishes, arrangements are now in progress to turn Ghana into a republic.
Ghana is free.
In 1957, Ghana became the first sub-Saharan state to be granted independence by transfer of power to Kwame Nkrumah, widely considered the father of African nationalism.
He was impressed by the United States. He was a student here. The Americans did something extraordinary. He said, the 13 colonies, instead of each one becoming independent, they came together, created a union. Power is in the union. That is the way Nkrumah explained the American dream and the American realization and so on. So he dreamed for something like that in Africa.
At long last, the battle has ended.
Ghana, Guinea, Mali Union has laid down a strong foundation for redemption of Africa, for which we've been strongly fighting. Ghana, Guinea, Mali, the nucleus of the great union. Ghana, Guinea, Mali, Africa's strongest foundation. Ghana, Guinea, Mali, the nucleus of the great union. Ghana, Guinea, Mali, has now once been laid forever.
Nkrumah had inspired others with his vision of a United States of Africa. Men like Leopold Senghor in Senegal, Félix Houphouët-Boigny in Côte d'Ivoire, and Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya. Men who had received colonial education. With the idea of empire increasingly unpalatable to the voting public, European governments had little choice but to work with the nationalists. The pressure for wholesale decolonization had been building ever since the end of the Second World War. The tipping point came on Wednesday, the 3rd of February, 1960.
The wind of change is blowing through this continent. And whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact.
British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan delivered a warning shot to the whites of apartheid South Africa and a death blow to the colonial venture across the continent.
That signaled, to my mind, the idea that Britain disapproved and the world disapproved of apartheid and the racism of apartheid. But it didn't necessarily mean that we were giving up on our role in Africa. I didn't think so.
In fact, within 10 months of the Wind of Change speech, Britain had surrendered 2 key African territories, France 14. The rate of decolonization when it arrived was breathtaking. Many were freed without bloodshed. 1960 was hailed the Year of Africa, and hurried withdrawals of the colonial powers continued into the next 3 decades.
By late 1953, the economic boom that had arrived after the Second World War had already transformed the country.
We were a self-confident people for the first time since 1929. People putting money in the banks. The real wages were going up 4.5% a year. It's just incredible to think about that now.
America in the 1950s was very rapidly becoming a consumer society. People were buying more and selling more than ever before in history. For the first time, more Americans were doing white-collar work than manual labor. And life was getting better for a lot of American families. Propelled by the powerful economy, they were stepping into the middle class at a rate of more than $1 million a year. With extra money to spend and plenty of shiny new merchandise to choose from, people bought things whether they needed them or not, sometimes just to match the pace of their neighbors. It was in the early 1950s that one of America's most intense love affairs blossomed most brightly.
We plug this thing in and turn on this box, and there are people there. Well, I want to tell you, we did not move for days.
You sat in front of that set even when there was nothing on but the test pattern. You thought, you can't tell, they're liable to put on something right now.
Television sets were rapidly becoming affordable for the average consumer, and as they did, the demand for new programming became overwhelming.
That's right, boys and girls.
Most television programs aired live with all the flaws of a live performance, yet even with mistakes, most viewers loved the tube.
The television business was a sandbox where you could go in with almost any idea and you have a chance to do it. It was an amazing period of time.
Radio loved nothing worried traditionalists more than the new kind of music being performed by singers such as Lloyd Price.
Oh, now, Lordy, 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 Miss Claudia, girl, you sure look good to me.
Well, it was really race music. We had maybe 2 radio stations in New Orleans that played that music. It had no name to it. It was just music.
Ready, set, go, man, go. I got a gal that I love so
By 1955, the music did have a name, rock and roll, and young people everywhere were listening to it. Wisconsin native Marty Rosenblum was then 15 years old.
I got my own portable radio, and at night, I could pick up all the southern stations, and I heard Little Richard for the first time. And my whole world changed. Everything changed. I would call WAPL in Appleton, Wisconsin, and ask them to play Little Richard, and they said that the station manager wouldn't allow Little Richard on the radio because his was the devil's music. So I knew he was good.
It was a much more infectious kind of music that we'd ever heard before, and it had an edge.
There were suggestive things in it, and you know, it was kind of risque, and the parents were saying, this is going to ruin our kids.
Their concern was that their daughters and even their sons was falling in love with black people.
Sam Phillips was the owner of Sun Records, a Southern music label.
You know what my answer was from day one was, I truly can look you straight in the eye and tell you they're not falling in love with black or white or green or yellow. They're falling in love with the vitality of the music.
And it wasn't long before white musicians like Bill Haley and his Comets were making the charts with rock hits of their own. But the music was still waiting for its first superstar. And in 1956, he arrived.
I was in this little soda shop, and on came this song, and this guy started singing, and there was like stillness, and then everybody started dancing, and this like wave of energy came over the place, and I said, my God, this is wonderful. I turned around to the girl next to me, and I said, who was that? And she looked at me as if I was like from another planet, and she said just one word. She said, Elvis.
Amazingly, 50s America had moved little beyond the days of Jim Crow. Particularly in the South, life among blacks and whites remained separate and unequal.
There was no way you could be black in this country and not be affected by it. Here I was selling millions of records around the world, hero everywhere, and I couldn't get a hot dog in Baltimore unless I went to the back door.
It wasn't right, but that's just how it was. That was just life.
On December the 1st, 1955, on a public bus in Montgomery, Alabama, life began to change. By refusing to give up her seat to a white man, a tired seamstress named Rosa Parks quietly ignited a revolution.
The day that Rosa Parks was arrested, a low murmur went through the whole city. And overnight, this thing bloomed.
Led by a charismatic young preacher named Martin Luther King, the city's black community organized a peaceful boycott of the buses. They walked instead.
We will do it in an orderly fashion. This is a non-violent protest. We are depending on moral and spiritual forces.
White policemen responded by arresting black carpool drivers. White extremists bombed King's home.
Martin always said, you know, if you don't have anything that you die for, what do you have to live for? Nobody thought we could stay off the buses. None of those people wanted to lose their jobs. But Martin Luther had instilled in them so rightly that we must all make a sacrifice, that the buses continue to run empty.
They did, for 381 days. On November the 13th, 1956, the Supreme Court ordered the buses desegregated. Martin Luther King was now the undisputed leader of the civil rights movement.
The colored population idolized Martin Luther.
We are not going back to the buses bragging about a victory.
People experienced the self-esteem that they had never experienced before. And they had been given
for the last 12 months.
A light, a beacon at the end of the tunnel.
That light reached Melba Beals, a 15-year-old high school student in Little Rock, Arkansas.
I was very conscious of what was going on and wanting it to wash over me and wash over Little Rock.
It was about to. In 1954, the Supreme Court had ordered the integration of all public schools in its famous decision Brown versus the Board of Education. 3 years later, that decision would be severely tested at Little Rock's all-white Central High School. Despite the federal court order, Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus had no intention of allowing black students to attend Central High, and he ordered the Arkansas National Guard to surround the school. On September the 3rd, Melba Beals and 8 other black students walked towards Central High. One, Elizabeth Eckford, became separated from her friends and was surrounded by a white mob that included Ann Thompson.
There was just a lot of electricity in the air. It was almost a circus-like atmosphere. All these parents on the sideline urging us on and telling us, you know, get out there, don't let them get in.
There are mobs on her heels, you know, like dogs, nipping at her. Policemen are watching this. Every time she tries to step between them, they close ranks on her.
If Central High was to be integrated, it would have to be by order of the president. Eisenhower was at first reluctant to interfere.
His record on civil rights was not a good one until 1957, in the crisis at Little Rock. And there, a fundamental question was dealt with. Do the states have the right to impose their own social order in defiance of federal court orders? Eisenhower answered it decisively, said, no, we have made a national commitment. We are going to desegregate this society. And if it takes the 101st Airborne to do it, so be it.
Awful. It was, I mean, that is vivid still. You know, I could just see Little Rock just being in a state of siege by the troops, you know. That was real fear.
3 weeks after the Little Rock Nine were turned away from Central High, they returned, accompanied by troops of the 101st Airborne.
We're all in an Army station wagon, machine gun mounts. It's a pretty heady day. It's not what everybody gets to go to school. You got 1,000 paratroopers, you got helicopters, Jeeps in front, Jeeps behind.
And we stepped out of the Jeep into this square of soldiers who were serious. You know, as I walked up the steps that day at Central High School, I can remember the click of the leather boots on those stairs. And I remember being so impressed by who they were. You know, these are Americans. I'm an American. And so the first time I get the feeling that there is hope, that there is a reason I salute the flag, that this is what America is about.
I felt that Little Rock would never be the same again. We would never know life as we've known it again, because 9 people walked into a school building.
My teenage models had been the kids who danced on American Bandstand. And all of a sudden come the Little Rock Nine. And I can remember having the feeling that they've been tied and tested, and they've survived. Someday, in some way, I'm going to be tested this way too. So I think when the movement comes along in the 1960s, I'm ready for it.
At long last, the battle has ended.
Ghana, Guinea, Mali Union has laid down a strong foundation for redemption of Africa, for which we've been strongly fighting. Ghana, Guinea, Mali, the nucleus of the great union. Ghana, Guinea, Mali, Africa's strongest foundation. Ghana, Guinea, Mali, the nucleus of the great union. Ghana, Guinea, Mali, has now once been laid forever.
The Second World War turned lives upside down. People from different races worked together and played together. Building this history of mixed-race Britain, the young found forbidden love, and the old, well, they just couldn't understand it.
I do remember my father saying, now you've taken up with this black man, you will never get a decent boyfriend. Never.
The decades after the war saw society go from official contempt.
The black man has a different set of standards, values, morals and principles. In many cases, their grandfathers were eating each other.
To grudging acceptance.
I'm not racial, I'm not any prejudice of any kind, but I wouldn't let my children intermarry.
Through it all, love across the racial divide would prevail.
To me, it was just wonderful meeting all these different people. I thought they were beautiful looking because I always loved people with dark skin. I think they're so attractive and they look so healthy. I thought I had won the jackpot.
When our American allies arrived in 1942, many more of these mixed-race romances blossomed. These images of black GIs dancing with English girls so alarmed the American government, it deemed them material calculated to unduly inflame racial prejudice. The publication of any photographs conveying what was described as boyfriend-girlfriend implications was subsequently banned. And no wonder, back in the US, mixed-race marriages were illegal in 2/3 of the states. No such laws existed in Britain, but here too the arrival of black Americans en masse began to cause concern in some quarters. Over 100,000 African-American servicemen were stationed all over the country.
Anything new in the way of drill is news nowadays, and a company of coloured troops in Kettering give the town quite a show every time they march through on their way to chow.
For many Britons living in villages and market towns, it was the first time they'd ever seen a black face, and for some, it caused panic. Take Mrs. May, for example, a vicar's wife from Weston-super-Mare. According to an article in the Sunday Pictorial, the minute she heard that black American troops had reached her husband's parish, she called an emergency meeting of the WI to advise local women about how they should behave towards the black Americans. Just listen to what she had to say. Move if seated next to them in the cinema, cross the road to avoid them, have no social relationship, and on no account must coloured troops be invited into the homes of white women. Unfortunately for the Mrs. Mays of this world, more and more young women were choosing to ignore her advice. They not only invited black GIs into their homes, but also into their beds. And now it wasn't only the self-appointed guardians of British morality that were alarmed.
In Parliament, the Conservative MP Maurice Petherick warned the Secretary of State for War, Anthony Eden, that the blackamoors consorting with white girls will result in a number of half-caste babies when they're gone. A bad thing for any country.
But in dance halls up and down the country, British women made their own choices.
My mother.
GIs had to get the approval of the US Army to marry, and permission was usually denied because of America's attitude to mixed-race marriages.
Fence me in, no. Papa, don't you fence me in.
And it wasn't just heartbroken girlfriends they left behind. About 1,000 mixed-race babies were now fatherless. Those earlier warnings about black GIs leaving babies behind had become a reality.
The arrival of more than 400 happy Jamaicans. They've come to seek work in Britain and are ready and willing to do any kind of job that will help the motherland along the road to prosperity. They're all full of hope for the future, so let's make them very welcome as they begin their new life over here.
Now came the years of mass immigration following a change in the law in 1948, giving British citizenship to anyone from the Commonwealth and the colonies and the right to settle here. Thousands of single men arrived looking for work. They'd left their families and sweethearts behind. Inevitably, they found solace in the arms of local white girls. Britain's racial landscape changed forever.
A letter from a Liz of Cardiff to a woman's magazine in 1951 sums up the situation pretty neatly. I'm very much in love with a coloured man. He's the nicest, kindest boy I've ever met, and I know he'll make a splendid husband. But my parents are against our marriage. Can they stop me marrying? And the agony aunt's reply, not unless you're under 21, but I hope for your own sake that you think things over very carefully. Many coloured men are fine people, but scientists don't yet know if it's wise for two such very different races as white and black to marry. For sometimes children of mixed marriages seem to inherit the worst characteristics of each race.
In fact, such thinking put forward by the eugenics movement before the war was outdated.
Take me. I'm just a plain and simple citizen of Europe. I can see that this race theory has caused misery and suffering. But you really mean that there's nothing in it? It's all just a lot of bunk?
In 1950, the UN's Education and Science Agency had ruled that there was no biological justification for prohibiting intermarriage between persons of different ethnic groups. In 1953, the ever-so-respectable 32-year-old Peggy Cripps, daughter of Labour MP Sir Stafford Cripps, got married. Her wedding took place in London's fashionable St John's Wood and was the society wedding of the year. But this was a society wedding with a difference, because Peggy Cripps's groom was not some British toff. He was Joe Appiah, a Ghanaian chieftain's son.
An African with some kind of a snake charm said to bring luck was well in the picture at the church.
When a journalist asked her why she was marrying a coloured man, Peggy replied, "Because I love him, and love is greater than colour, creed or race." What she was saying, so simply yet so eloquently, is that love can cross all racial barriers.
When we're a bride and groom.
Actually, their wedding said even more than that. It showed that mixed-race relationships were happening at all levels of society. For left-leaning liberals, Peggy and Joe's union symbolized the ideal of a multicultural society. But when their wedding photos were syndicated around the world, many were outraged.
Charles Swart, South Africa's Justice Minister, and one of the architects of the country's apartheid system, brandished their wedding photograph in Parliament and declared, "It's a disgusting photograph of a wedding between the daughter of a former British cabinet minister and a black native. If such a thing were ever to happen in South Africa, it would be the end."
Lambeth and Brixton have been much in the news recently following the controversy that has raged over the immigration of West Indians to this country.
On average, 12,000 West Indians were entering Britain each year, and more were settling down with local women.
To help solve the problems raised when white and coloured people live in the same neighbourhood, the Borough of Lambeth organised a no-colour bar dance.
By the time this film was made in 1955, the total black population in Britain had risen to 125,000. But the sight of mixed-race couples on the dance floor was still something that caused a stir.
East had met West on common ground, few were wallflowers for very long. The rhythm of the mambo was doing its bit towards racial unity.
Officially, scientific racism had been rejected, but amongst the general public, prejudice was still widespread.
People say that the colour bar is beginning to fade, but I wonder if it is. I think if we were honest with ourselves, that we'd admit it would be a bit of a shock if we were told that our sister or daughter was going to marry a coloured man.
Conservative parliamentary candidate James Wentworth-Day certainly had strong feelings on this matter.
My view is this, that no first-class nation can afford to produce a race of mongrels. And that is what we're doing. Too much mixed blood. Look at the other angle. The black man, and I refuse this humbug of talking about the coloured man, he's black and we're white, has a different set of standards, values, morals and principles. In many cases, their grandfathers were eating each other.
By the late 1950s, the buying power of the young was recognized and a new word entered the vocabulary.
Teenagers, guys and dolls, can be trained in a few weeks to earn £8 or £10 a week. The shops know it, so every town has a store with teenage departments, thriving on giving the young people the fashions they demand. The gramophone industry cashes in on the well-off teenagers to some tune. 80% of the disc output is bought by the youngsters. That's 50 million records a year in Britain alone. All industry knows that to please the teenagers is the golden way to big dividends.
Real wages for the under-21s were 10 times higher than before the war, and unemployment had almost disappeared.
The employers used to come round to the school a few months before we were due to leave, and you could select what you wanted to be. If you want to be a plumber, joiner, electrician, mechanic, they're all there. They all wanted apprentices, and it was so easy.
Look and listen to be quite sure that all these young people have got him. They're most definitely with it.
So much has been said about teenagers recently that I must admit I flinch at stepping on this well-trodden ground again. I certainly am not going to attempt to reach any profound conclusion. All that we hope to do is to observe a new type of teenager, a teenager who is making more money than was ever dreamt of in the old days, who has got a new spending power, and with that power is able to enjoy himself, or fails to enjoy himself, in a completely different way.
Unemployment in the UK did not exist in 1956. There were 10 vacancies for every jobless person. Those between the ages of 15 and 20 were in high demand.
Teenagers, guys and dolls, can be trained in a few weeks to earn £8 or £10 a week. The shops know it, so every town has a store with teenage departments, thriving on giving the young people the fashions they demand, distinctive teenage fashions.
Out went twin sets and pearls, in came stiletto heels and portable transistor radios.
The economic boom of the post-war period benefited the white teenagers of America as much as their parents. These children of the baby boom had expendable incomes from babysitting, mowing lawns, and allowances.
Parents gave their kids money, and kids had opportunities to make money. So they had money to buy records, they had money to buy clothes.
With the use of transistors in radios, music became completely portable. Kids could listen to their music without disturbing parents, and they could listen to it anywhere they wanted, in their bedrooms or on the street.
They had access to an automobile, which was unusual. There were radios in the cars, so all of a sudden this music became the soundtrack for a very large and affluent group of people.
The music on that soundtrack was the hot new sound of rock and roll. In post-war America, black recording artists, many of them blues performers, created a style of music they called rhythm and blues, a musical hybrid of blues, country boogie, gospel, and big band jazz. When rhythm and blues added electric guitars to the mix, a new sound was born.
The roots of rock and roll come from a lot of different areas. I think the biggest one is rhythm and blues, which was a very popular form of music with African Americans, hadn't quite crossed over to mainstream America, so that's one of the reasons why it sounded so new to most people.
Fashion, which had always been a version of what Dad wore, burst into the marketplace. The generation gap widened as teenagers began to create their own lifestyles, and nowhere was the division more marked than in popular music. In 1956, Bill Haley's film Rock Around the Clock hit Britain. The older generation were appalled, and it was banned in many towns. This was the early days of the youthquake. Away from the cities, the teenagers of London-based journalists hardly existed. Nevertheless, the rules, the fashions, and the tastes of the older generation had been challenged.
The end of meat rationing this weekend was the final step in dismantling the whole wartime system of food distribution. The 14-year story told by this book was over.
And she said, I don't want to boast, but I use Persil. And she took out her hanky and said, now that's what I call. You know, it was miles whiter than mine. It shook me, I can tell you. I always thought my whites were white until I saw hers.
White's white, but Persil washes whiter. That means cleaner.
Monday. How I hate the sight of washing. I used to enjoy it, too, before I was married. But then I only had to do my own undies and summer frocks. This household wash is just plain drudgery. Still, it's got to be done.
After all their inroads into the world of work in the war years, women were firmly pushed back into the home. The 50s became a decade dedicated to the ideal family. The role of the wife and mother was seen as vital in the bid to re-establish the old pre-war values.
I always like to be home in time to change. He likes to see me looking at my best. If I hurry home, I shall be able to have a doze before I have to think about getting his supper.
All the new household goods being advertised enforced the idea of women staying at home. But how could they afford them unless they went out to work? Despite the pressures to stay at home, there were more women workers in 50s Britain than ever before. But how much longer would women settle for limited expectations and lack of opportunity?
Traditional jazz also contributed to the sound of rock and roll, with the saxophone and stand-up bass, especially in the early days of the new sound. Saxophone solos were often heard long before guitar solos became popular. In 1953, Cleveland disc jockey Alan Freed played this new kind of music, this so-called Negro music, for his white teenaged listeners. It instantly became wildly popular. Thinking the new sensation needed a name, Freed coined the term rock and roll, and it stuck. Soon, DJs in other cities around the nation jammed the AM radio waves with the new music. If one person could be given the credit for inventing rock and roll, Chuck Berry is probably the one. Berry mixed all the right ingredients: country western guitar licks and a rhythm and blues tune with lyrics about fast cars and good-looking women. While he had been performing rock and roll songs for a few years, Berry's first mainstream hit, Maybelline, only came in the summer of 1955, when he crossed the color line and became a huge success with white audiences. Richard Penniman, using the stage name Little Richard, crossed over to white audiences with songs like Tutti Frutti, Lucille, and Good Golly Miss Molly. Sporting makeup and an extreme pompadour, this gospel singer from Georgia electrified his audiences in outrageous live shows. As the popularity of the music grew, white musicians co-opted the style but toned down the sexuality for a mainstream audience. Music stores were flooded with dozens of new recordings. In 1954, Bill Haley and the Comets released Rock Around the Clock. An immediate hit, the song was adopted as an unofficial anthem of the very first rock and roll generation. Not everyone was captivated by the sound of rock and roll. Many adults, especially those with conservative religious backgrounds, protested the spread of this new music. They claimed it was ruining the youth of America by overexciting their libidos with its hard-driving rhythms, suggestive lyrics, and the wild dancing brought on by the music. The anti-rock and roll movement, however, was never strong enough to stop the swelling tide of the new sound. As quickly as its popularity grew, rock and roll just as rapidly became part of youth culture in the 50s and American culture in general, especially when a 19-year-old truck driver from Memphis started recording.
It was Sam Phillips at Sun Records who said, this is legendary, he said, if I could find a white man that sang like a black man, I'd make $1 million. And it wasn't a racist remark, it was just saying that if I could find somebody who'd sing with that energy, that amount of sexual tension and that comedic sense too that was in rhythm and blues, he knew that he would have a winner.
Phillips found that winner. His name was Elvis Aaron Presley. Elvis Presley recorded his first song, That's All Right, in 1954. He combined a bluesy country boogie style with hard-driving rhythms and distinct vocals. Even though the record wasn't a huge success, his live performances with swinging hips and bedroom eyes won many fans. By 1956, Elvis had 3 hits on the record charts: Hound Dog, Don't Be Cruel, and Heartbreak Hotel. His slurring, sexy vocal style became his trademark and earned him the title King of Rock and Roll. But Presley had to temporarily give up his throne when, in 1958, Uncle Sam tapped him on the shoulder.
I don't really know who gave the name High Life.
But just before independence in Ghana, 1957, there were lots of Europeans in Ghana, and the bands used to play foxtrot and jazz and waltz and all those things. The richer Ghanaians and the politicians, when they had the dances, would be dancing to all these musical forms. So they had to arrange home music in a big band form. You know, so what was like suddenly became jazz. Became jazz, and that's what was called the high life.
At long last, the battle has ended.
Ghana, Guinea, Mali Union has laid down a strong foundation for redemption of Africa, for which we've been strongly fighting. Ghana, Guinea, Mali, the nucleus of the great union. Ghana, Guinea, Mali, Africa's strongest foundation. Ghana, Guinea, Mali, the nucleus of the great union. Ghana, Guinea, Mali, has now once been laid forever.
In some inner city areas, prejudice was being fueled by tension over jobs and housing. On Friday, August the 29th, 1958, there was a petty domestic dispute between Jamaican Ray Morrison and his pregnant Swedish wife May-Britt in London's Notting Hill.
The rowing couple was seen by a group of white teddy boys who started to heckle Ray. They were about to go even further, but were shocked by May-Britt's reaction. She shouted at them and told them to leave her husband alone. The next night, and it was after pub closing time, the gang spotted May-Britt again. She was out on her own. There goes the black man's trollop, they shouted. They chased her, and she was hit with an iron bar.
Over the next few nights, violent scenes erupted all over Notting Hill. A fear that West Indians were not only taking their jobs and housing, but their women as well, led to vicious nigger hunts by white teddy boys. In the early 60s, a rash of British feature films tackled the racial prejudice that had been so graphically exposed by the '58 riots. In Roy Ward Baker's 1961 film, Flame in the Streets, the bunch of teddy boy thugs are lifted straight from the streets of Notting Hill.
Go. Hold up, that'll send them crackers.
But the real focus of the film is the interracial relationship between factory worker Gabriel Gomez and his pregnant wife Judy.
You all right? How you feeling, woman? You ain't sick.
Oh, no, I'm just tired. I feel like I'm carrying an elephant. I'll get you tea.
Just stay there.
This film was truly groundbreaking. It was the first time cinema-goers would have seen a black man kissing a white woman. All those fears about the perfect British family being invaded, well, they were being played out on the big screen.
Listen, now on, I do the shopping, see? And let you carry them heavy loads up the stairs, woman.
Actor Earl Cameron was himself in a mixed-race marriage when he appeared in Flame in the Streets. For him, the film was just a mirror of real life.
That kiss that you give your wife, Judy, that was a pivotal moment, wasn't it?
I suppose so, but not all the set. It didn't mean anything. We didn't rehearse it. It just came natural. I just
You're kidding? That kiss that has since been looked at over and over again, so that's the first screen kiss. That wasn't in the script?
No. In fact, I even thought afterwards I should have kissed her a little stronger. I mean...
But what about beaming it into the nation's homes? In 1964, ITV set the nation's pulse racing with a television first.
Silly, you couldn't have known. We both thought it was the same
For weeks, the story of the relationship between Dr. Marler and Dr. Farmer had been building to this critical moment.
What are you doing?
I want to kiss you.
What for?
Just because.
Emergency Ward 10 was then one of Britain's most popular soap operas, regularly pulling in audiences of 15 million and up to 24 million at its peak. Now, the film Flame in the Streets had already featured mixed-race relationships some 3 years earlier, but this was the first time a mixed-race couple was actually seen kissing on British television. This was different. This brought the issue right into people's living rooms.
Ellie called for me tomorrow.
Yes, and me.
I remember.
By the mid-60s, Britain's immigrant population had expanded. As well as West Indians and Africans, over 100,000 Indian and Pakistanis had entered the country, despite the 1962 Commonwealth Immigrants Act, which sought to stem the flow. Some were young Asian doctors who, like Dr. Besborough, had come to Britain to find work in the expanding National Health Service.
Remember your first day, what it was like?
By 1968, there were 2 Race Relations Acts which outlawed discrimination in jobs and housing, protecting the rights of immigrants wanting to make a life for themselves in this country. Prejudice amongst the public had certainly not been eradicated, but a new liberalism was in the air. The late 60s saw the summer of love, the questioning of old ideas and a changing attitudes towards sex, to gender and race. In 1968, the BBC screened this pioneering documentary.
Donald Raymond, wilt thou have this woman to thy wedded wife, to live together after God's ordinance in the holy estate of matrimony?
I've come back begging you.
Another screen kiss, but unlike all those fictional clinches in the films and soaps that went before it, this was the first time a genuine kiss had been seen on British television. These weren't actors going through the motions. This was a real couple in love. The editor of the Radio Times magazine refused to use a photo of the couple kissing to publicise the programme. He said it was too provocative. Instead, he opted for this.
But despite the flurry of headlines this caused in the popular press, the programme itself was well received. It attracted huge viewing figures, and the broadsheets called it moving and compassionate.
By the late 1960s, Britain had undoubtedly changed. We'd gone from calling children like my brother-in-law Tony war casualties to having mixed-race relationships on prime-time television. Post-war Britain was finally coming to terms with just how diverse it had become. The new race relations legislation was a sign of that. But in many ways, this was still tolerance rather than celebration.
This is in our country's recent history. Mildred Jeter and Robert Loving fell madly in love in their hometown of Central Point, Virginia during the 50s. The only problem? Mildred was of African American and Native American descent, and Robert was white, and therefore they could not be wed under Virginia's Racial Integrity Law of 1924, which banned white people from marrying, quote, colored people. When Mildred became pregnant in 1958, Robert got in his truck and drove them 90 miles to Washington, D.C. to get married, where it was legal. The couple were arrested in their own home in the middle of the night, only 2 weeks into their marriage, after police received an anonymous tip that the couple had broken the law. A pregnant Mildred spent several nights in a jail cell, separated from her husband. They pleaded guilty and received a 1-year sentence, which was later suspended. In exchange, the Lovings were asked to leave Virginia and not return for 25 years, which they obliged. That was until the Lovings decided they had had enough. In 1963, right when the civil rights movement was in full force, the Lovings sought the help of Attorney General Robert Kennedy, who then took the case to the American Civil Liberties Union. They later took the case to Virginia, but when the state upheld the ruling, the Lovings and their attorneys took their argument to the Supreme Court. And in 1967, the United States Supreme Court struck down Virginia's law, and the Lovings were finally allowed to go back home.